Good morning and welcome. We're going to take about 30 seconds here for everybody to get logged in. Good morning. If you're just joining us, we'll get started here in just about 30 seconds or so. Go ahead and turn off Outlook here, Ken. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. So welcome, my name is Ken Paulman. I'm the director of the Energy News Network. We are based here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And our panelists are online here and ready to go. We'll introduce you to them here in just a moment. Bri, if you want to hit the next slide, please. Thank you. So I want to acknowledge the Energy and Policy Institute, ION Ohio, and the Ohio Environmental Council for joining us today and being a part of this event. Again, I'm the director of the Energy News Network. We are a editorially independent news service published by Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy's mission is to shape and drive bold policy solutions to achieve equitable carbon neutral economies. Together, we are working toward a vision of a just, prosperous, and resilient future powered by a shared commitment to a carbon neutral economy. You can find more information about the Energy News Network at energynews.us. And let's get to the next slide. So we will have our panelists introduce themselves here very shortly. I want to just point out a couple of housekeeping items here. We do have an online Q&A function for you to submit questions to the panelists. I will be monitoring that, and I won't necessarily get to every question immediately. I can't guarantee we'll get to all the questions, but we'll do our best to kind of weave those into the conversation as we go. So feel free to use that function. If you've got if more of a comment than a question, I would ask that you not use the question and answer feature for that. Don't be that guy. But we welcome questions or requests for clarification throughout the conversation, because there's a lot to cover here. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, and go ahead and just kind of tell us your name, your affiliation, and kind of just a little bit about your work and how it relates to this whole story. And we will start with Dave Anderson.
Hi there, my name is David Anderson. I am the Policy and Communications Manager for the Energy and Policy Institute. And I've been doing work in Ohio, basically researching, and at one point earlier in my career, advocating against efforts to roll back the state's renewable energy and energy efficiency standards for electric utilities. And really, over the years, I've covered quite a bit of information about FirstEnergy's role in those attacks, and also some coal and nuclear bailout proposals that have been floated at the federal and state level in Ohio. And of course, we've now seen that kind of blew up into a much bigger story about bribery and corruption. So happy to share what I've learned over the years and listen to what others have to say as well with great interest.
Great, Kathy.
My name's Kathy Kowalski. I'm a journalist and attorney based in Ohio. I've been reporting for Energy News Network since about 2013. And had been covering a number of developments with FirstEnergy, AEP, and the other utilities over the years. For the last 2 years, I've been working with Energy News Network and ION Ohio on a joint project to uncover different aspects of the what's behind House Bill 6 and what led up to it and where we may be going from there.
Okay, Randi.
Hi, everybody. My name is Randi Leppla. I'm with the Ohio Environmental Council. I'm our Vice President of Energy Policy and lead Energy Council. The mission of the OEC is to secure healthy land, air, and water for all who call Ohio home. So we work on public lands, clean energy, water issues, and we also work on democracy issues, because you can't have a healthy environment without a healthy democracy, as we will talk about more today, I think. Over the last couple of years, I've certainly started a side career as an anti-corruption attorney, it appears, with some of the ongoings that we'll talk about today.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Lucia.
Hi, my name is Lucia Walinchus. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Center for Journalism, for SEO purposes, Eye on Ohio. So our mission is to promote the public good by pursuing in-depth, underreported, and high-impact journalism, which exposes injustice and explores its consequences. Our reporting investigates the truth, holds those in power accountable, and seeks solutions. So obviously this is a topic that we've been covering very heavily because it fits squarely within our mission.
Great, thank you. And so those of you who are just joining us, I'd note that we have a Q&A function here. If you want to submit questions, we'll try our best to get to those as they come in during the discussion. And to kick things off, because people are probably coming at this with varying levels of knowledge, we thought we'd start with a really high level overview of kind of the story so far. So Kathy, would you like to kind of give us a quick rundown on what exactly are we talking about here? What the hell happened in Ohio?
A lot. So first, let's turn the clock back a decade. Nuclear and coal-powered plants were having trouble competing with natural gas coming online from fracked horizontal wells. At the same time, the cost of renewables was starting to come down. FirstEnergy, American Electric Power, and other utilities asked Ohio regulators for subsidies, and after a few years, they got some, but those were temporary and subject to court challenge, so the utilities wanted the law changed. Gerrymandered districts pretty much assured Republicans a majority in the state, but even at that, FirstEnergy could not get its nuclear Zen bill passed. And Zen was actually an acronym FirstEnergy made up. I'm going to skip over a whole lot now. Fast forward to last summer, federal authorities brought charges against former Speaker Larry Householder and others, alleging a $60 million conspiracy to pass and defend House Bill 6. The alleged plan was to use dark money, that is money that couldn't be traced to whoever paid it, to do three things. First, elect householder-friendly folks and get Larry to become Speaker of the House. Second, ram through House Bill 6. And third, prevent a voter referendum on the law. Most of the money on the alleged scheme came from FirstEnergy and its subsidiaries, but some came from others. House Bill 6 was passed in 2019. It did several things. First, it subsidized FirstEnergy's former nuclear plants to the tune of about $1 billion over 6 years. It recession-proofed utilities by letting them peg revenues to 2018 levels. It subsidized two 1950s era coal plants. The cost for that's roughly $700 million through 2030. It provided money for a handful of solar plants, but about $20 million, so pittance compared to the rest of the bill. And it also gutted Ohio's energy efficiency and renewable energy standards. The subsequent investigation focused a lot on FirstEnergy, although other companies and entities also paid money into the alleged scheme. As a result, Sam Randazzo, the head of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, resigned last fall after FirstEnergy disclosed that it had paid him about $4 million just before he became head of the PUCO. Several high-level FirstEnergy folks were also fired. And then this summer, FirstEnergy made a deal with the federal government where it admitted wrongdoing and agreed to pay $230 million as a penalty. Where we are right now is that the nuclear subsidies have been repealed, the recession proofing has been repealed, but the rest of House Bill 6 is still in place, and bills to repeal the rest of it, either in part or in full, have been introduced, but when or whether those will get passed, we don't know.
Great, thanks for that. And so those of you who are here to get into the weeds, I promise you we are going to get into the weeds as we go. So, and there's actually a good question I'll throw right out here from Rich Weiss here. Does the average Ohioan know too much, too little, or just enough about the FirstEnergy bribery conspiracy? Related question, does the average Ohio media outlet report too much, too little, or just enough about the FirstEnergy conspiracy, and why? Who wants to take that?
I'll comment on it, but I'm sure others have thoughts too. I think it depends. Sometimes we're in our own echo chambers. I talk to a lot of people that know a lot about it because they know what I do. And so they're always interested in talking about it, like all of you that are tuning in today. But I would say, based on the fact that most of these guys got reelected into our legislature, that folks don't understand really the magnitude of what happened here enough, or they may have voted them out. So that's kind of the lens I take on it. And I do think, especially the folks on this call with me, I'm lucky to be in the presence of some really great investigative journalists here. There's been lots and lots of coverage of this topic. And there's been lots of great work done with the Plain Dealer and the Dispatch and the Dayton Daily News. So I think there's been some really good coverage of this, but I feel like a lot of folks wonder, how can I make an impact, and does it matter? Or is this just going to keep happening?
Yeah, and that's we're going to get to that later in the conversation here, so definitely hold that thought. But what I want to kind of get into now is part of the problem here is that this is really complicated. I mean, as eloquently as Kathy was able to explain it here. So what specifically is FirstEnergy accused of, and what are some other players involved, and what specifically are they accused of doing? Who wants to jump in on that? Don't make me call on you.
I can.
I'll defer to Dave in a minute, but just for starters, FirstEnergy admitted this summer that it used dark money organizations for purposes of affecting public policy through two individuals primarily, and its admissions referred to the former Speaker of the House and the former head of the PUCO.
Yeah, Dave, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think if you look at the charging documents from that federal case involving FirstEnergy, the prosecutors did use the word bribes. So certainly they admitted to that to some extent. And also we have seen the Security and Exchange Commission subpoena American Electric Power, which also benefited from House Bill 6's coal subsidies and funded a similar dark money entity that poured some money into supporting Larry Householder's dark money group Generation Now. And then sort of a third tier is that there's a few coal companies, including Murray Energy and the Boyd companies, that have popped up, not been named, but you can tell just by the way that the evidence involving them is described by federal prosecutors in the case. But none of those other three companies, AEP, Murray, or Boyd, have been charged by the Department of Justice itself. So sort of a, we'll see where that goes from there type of thing.
And so we're at a point now where so Householder was expelled from the legislature. There are people calling for a PUCO investigation. But what is really going on right now? We know there is a lot of litigation happening right now. And Lucia, maybe do you want to kind of walk us through where we're at currently in that area?
Sure. So this is one of the sort of stumbling blocks in terms of people being able to follow this, is there's just so many moving pieces. So many people have sued pretty much everyone because there's a lot of harm here, right? There's obviously a harm to the public in terms of, the criminal things filed, in terms of, the SEC has had an investigation. Obviously, there's been quite a few shareholder lawsuits. Shareholders have been wanting to get their money back. Ratepayers have been wanting to get their money back. So there's the rate and refund cases. There's the Sixth Circuit appeal. There's the FES bankruptcy, where we're able to get a lot of documents just, to be able to report on it in the first place. Obviously, Attorney General Yost's case. On Monday, Randazzo filed a motion to have more space to write even more. So I thought, oh boy, this is going to be fun coming up. But really what it comes down to is, we're looking to see, there's pieces missing here, right? Somehow $60 million disappeared. Where did that go? How did it get there? And there's there's been a lot of different issues in terms of, who has jurisdiction over what. So for example, this very morning, the Puko had had a pre-conference hearing where they looked at two big motions in terms of, what they could disclose and what they couldn't disclose. So very, very big, I think, a copy of the internal investigation. So this has been, you basically, FirstEnergy and the related companies have been arguing that this should be privileged information, right? But the OCC is saying, wait a minute, you did this internal investigation, you fired all these high-level people. I need the document that says why you fired them, right? So in this case, that copy of the internal investigation within the next 7 days is going to go before Attorney Examiner Gregory Price. He's going to look at it and see if it is privileged. And then they're also, he did grant, access to the factual documents in terms of, what they concluded in order to fire those people.
Excellent. And we know that this has also gotten the attention of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Securities Exchange Commission and other sort of federal entities. And Dave, do you want to give us a roundup of what's happening outside of Ohio related to this?
Sure. So the SEC has subpoenaed both FirstEnergy and AEP in connection with the House Bill 6 scandal. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission already had an audit of FirstEnergy going on while House Bill 6 was being debated and then passed. And then you had that whole ballot referendum petition campaign that FirstEnergy spent millions of dollars to quash. And they have since escalated that to include a more formal investigation and subpoena seeking records related to HB6 lobbying, essentially. And then in other states like New Jersey and Maryland, the Public Utility Commission and state consumer advocates that represent utility ratepayers across those states have called on the Public Utility Commissions there to investigate any overlap between the Ohio scandal and the FirstEnergy utilities in those states, and in particular, whether any money collected from ratepayers there was funneled into this massive dark money and bribery scheme. So I think those are the big ones. And then I would just mention that Puko is also looking into this in kind of a fragmented way. I think they have 4 reviews and audits involving HB6 that have started to trickle out over the summer and this month. With mixed results there. So I'm sure we'll get into those findings, but can move on now.
Excellent, thank you. So that's where we are. And so we've talked about what's happening. So let's, for the next section, talk about how this happened. How on earth did we get here? It's an action on behalf of utility that seems particularly brazen. I think it would even make states like Illinois blush. So what are the conditions within the state that enabled this to basically kind of go undetected up until the FBI started digging in on it? And that's a loaded question because I know we detected some of this before the FBI, so that's a hint. Whoever wants to dive in.
Well, I think that's going to be sort of the key question. So yesterday they just released the 165-page audit. Depending on your view of that, there was no sort of smoking gun. They never said, oh, there was a major violation, but there's sort of a lot of minor violations. They mentioned, problems, 10 years back. So I think that, we're sort of starting to get an outline of, just policies and procedures that weren't in place. It doesn't seem like there was any one thing, but sort of accumulation of many things across several companies over time that kind of added to the brazenness.
And I think in that audit, what was interesting was, even though it said no major violations, the minor violations that it listed were things like having a common, shared services like a common money pot, and, reporting issues and consultants, and, things that ultimately seem to have facilitated the flow of money, and that at least raise a question in my mind of what would be considered a major violation. Right. And then it's not just what was going on at FirstEnergy. There's also the regulatory system of how commissioners are appointed, and then the legislature, which has been dominated in a certain way. I don't know, Randi, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna kind of bring in, Kathy. I mean, this is something of a perfect storm, I guess, because we've got captive ratepayers, obviously, with utilities that are doing things kind of behind the scenes. It's a complicated process, which is, why we need the PUCO to really dig in here and make sure that they're holding the utilities accountable, right? The purpose of our utilities and the purpose of the PUCO really is to be making sure we have reliable utility service in the state, and that's what it's supposed to be for. So we really need to be getting back to that baseline level. But again, for the perfect storm, we've got a legislature that's very fossil fuel friendly right now, which can be seen in lots and lots of things, not just House Bill 6. There's kind of a slew of things that you can look at to see that kind of pattern that we've seen. And then campaign finance rules that have been loosened with Citizens United has really allowed for these dark money groups to kind of blossom and cause a lot of problems that we hadn't seen in the past.
I'll turn to another audience question here. So from John, the corruption issues are obviously bad, but do you think these issues obscure the fact that HB6 was such terrible energy policy and wouldn't have been passed without dark money?
I mean, I think there's been a lot of outcry about House Bill 6 being terrible energy legislation. And the corruption or the alleged corruption came about in large part because it was so bad it was not otherwise passing. You had conservatives in the legislature previously who were saying, I may be fossil fuel friendly, but I don't want to give this subsidy or that subsidy. And so I think it's known that there are problems.
And yeah, so what else, do we have anything to add on the dark money angle? Anyone else want to throw anything out there?
I think in the early coverage in the media when Larry Householder was first arrested and a detailed affidavit from an FBI agent was filed in court publicly, people picked up on the fact that they actually had like audio recordings of meetings and phone calls involving some of the people involved in this scandal. And, even Householder and his crew of political consultants who were charged in the case were kind of always joking about, just like how horrible the advertising they were running through these dark money groups was, and how effective it was proving and beating up essentially their fellow legislators to the point that they felt like they had to accept the bill. And there was also a tell-all book written by one of the lobbyists who was charged and unfortunately committed suicide in the Householder case. But he wrote about essentially how the policy itself was not very well loved. And it really was because of the dark money and the advertising involved, and FirstEnergy really driving the train on that, that the bill passed to begin with.
Yeah, just if I can add on to that real quick, Ken. I mean, why I was saying it was a perfect storm is some of what Dave was saying, right? There were multiple attempts to get a bailout for FirstEnergy's nuclear plants in prior General Assembly. So this was not a new concept. It simply suddenly gained, all of the pieces it really needed and all of the different parts to really get rammed through as part of House Bill 6. So, they've been looking for this bailout for a while. It had been it hadn't been picked up. Frankly, the legislature hadn't been interested in it. But when they got it to this place, we're able to package together some things that different pieces of the legislature didn't like, coupled with that dark money, and then the alleged bribery. I think that's kind of where landed us where we are, and it's not good policy, right? There was some comments by the governor at one point after the bribery and the indictments came out that, well, it's still good policy, and I think that's been proven to be false. Right now we've got all of those pieces repealed Kathy was talking about, but we've also got energy waste reduction legislation pending at the state now, because I think legislators recognize they went too far, and there are several bills pending to repeal the OVAC subsidies, and we hope those move in the fall.
I would just add quickly too that most of the major components of HB 6 were proposed in the legislature before Larry Householder and DeWine were in charge, and didn't really fly either because they couldn't get a majority of support or because of the previous governor Kasich's veto pen. So sort of tells you that there was obviously a pretty big switch, even though utilities obviously had a lot of power in Ohio before then.
And I think the switch in governors is an important point to note, because John Kasich, for all of his policy positions, even though, for example, he signed a bill that froze the clean energy standards for 2 years, when the legislature wanted to just kind of gut them in 2016, he vetoed that so that they at least came back in a weakened form. DeWine, signed House Bill 6 within hours of its passing, and has pretty much gone along with, I'd say, most of what the fossil fuel groups have wanted, despite using all of the above language.
And should we, go ahead, Lucia.
I was just saying, I think there's just sort of this perfect storm of Citizens United adding to this, fewer journalists. This is a very detailed and thick subject to take on, period. And then we have people who are willing to take advantage of it. So dark money especially has been difficult because each one of these things was funneled through a 501c4. So if we had been able to, because everyone who I got a flyer in the mail that said that I could tell you was from very shady people. But, unless we have that layer of transparency, we really can't fight this.
And I was going to go ahead and jump into another question from the audience here, because we were starting to talk about Governor DeWine a little bit. So Peter is asking, with Governor DeWine continuing to stick up for HB 6 even after the news of the scandal kept coming out, is there any indication that the governor was either in the know or involved? With Householder and Randazzo being the first two dominoes to fall, DeWine seemed like he might be next. We would add too that DeWine was also very quick to appoint Sam Randazzo as chair of the PUCO. So anyone want to speculate on what happens next with the governor?
I think I can comment a little bit on this, and I'm sure others have thoughts again too, but it seems unclear how involved anybody was from that level up. Governor DeWine did appoint Sam Randazzo very quickly, and a lot of his comments around that appointment were that former Chair Randazzo had a lot of experience and background in this, and certainly he'd been working in this field for 40 years. Wasn't the kind of experience that was helpful for a clean energy future, of course, as we've seen, but I think it remains to be seen who was really involved with that, whether the governor had any direct understanding of kind of what was going to happen after that appointment, or whether there were other folks in his office that may have been involved instead.
And along those lines, there are people close to DeWine who have links to utilities. Dan Tierney, who I think is, I may have the title wrong, but I think he's like one of his chief legislative policy people, had at one point been the head of one of the dark money groups that funneled money to Generation Now. Somebody else had been with AEP in his administration. The head of the nominating committee that recommends people for appointment to the PUCO, had some background as a FirstEnergy lobbyist, I think. So there are these different connections.
So we have another question in from David. How can Randazzo take bribes and not be charged with a crime? Anyone want to answer that one?
I don't think we know whether that is the case definitively yet or not. Seems like the FBI and Department of Justice agents involved in these cases have been pretty upfront from when the charges against Larry Householder were first announced, that the investigations are ongoing and they'll follow where the evidence leads, essentially. And in Energy Harbor, the former FirstEnergy subsidiary's bankruptcy case, they've avoided publicly filing some information related to their lobbyist role in the passing of House Bill 6, essentially by telling the bankruptcy judge that, hey, hold off, you know, like we're still involved in an ongoing grand jury investigation. Let's finish that up first, and then we can, you know, resume these issues in this case. And he's been okay with doing that. But it sort of tells you that there's still grand juries going on. And the whole thing wasn't dealt with completely by this deferred prosecution agreement that FirstEnergy reached. You know, Larry Householder hasn't even gone to trial yet. So we'll see where it goes, essentially.
This was also a question that came up before the PUCO today. Actually, the OCC had filed a motion to basically, you know, the thrust of their argument was, you know, there's a document that says, you know, this $4.3 million was for political purposes, and, you know, like where are those documents? So, and, you know, FirstEnergy's argument was, you know, we gave you the consulting contract already. So the judge ruled that basically any factual documents related to that request would be granted, and any so the long story short is, I agree with Mr. Anderson that basically, you know, further down the line, that's probably going to be on the table once they can connect those dots.
Yeah, and some of the questions that are coming in, I do want to acknowledge the reader questions coming in. A lot of them have to do with what's going to happen next, which we will get to later in the conversation, I promise, including sort of what are the levers that the public has to get involved. But I will jump to another question here from Mike. Why do you think AEP, Dayton Power and Light, and Duke Energy have gotten off without a scratch, even though they are getting millions in subsidies out of HB6?
I would echo a little bit of what Dave said, that we still don't know whether there will be further charges or investigations made. There was money, for example, that went from AEP to a nonprofit group, 501c4, that in turn, some of that went to Generation Now, and there were arguments about how much anybody knew or didn't know. But again, we don't have access to that information. I don't know what investigations, if any, may be going on. AEP has said it did not know anything unlawful was going on. But again, we don't know what else may come in the future.
Yeah, part of the issue here is that it seems like we're in kind of the middle chapter of all of this, and it sounds like a lot of folks are kind of hungry for a quick resolution, but we're really not going to have a quick resolution, are we? And so maybe this would be a good opportunity to kind of shift gears into what happens next. And this is a question that sort of has to do with leverage. And we'll start with, and this is a little bit more background too, but one question we didn't get to is, are ratepayers paying now for FirstEnergy's political influence?
I think, part of that is what some of those cases at the Public Utilities Commission are trying to determine. And so, like Lucia was saying, there's a report that just came out yesterday on one case, but there are 4 different cases moving at the same time. So we don't know for sure. But it seems tough to think that there might not be something in there that was ratepayer funded money, given the way utilities are set up, frankly. I mean, it's just the business and the nature of the business. So I think that remains to be seen for sure.
I would give a slightly different answer of yes. The Public Utility Commission of Ohio audited FirstEnergy based on some disclosures that the company made during earnings call with investors and earnings report that it filed in February, where they said, as part of our internal investigation into like the Larry Householder criminal case, we've uncovered 10 plus years of improper accounting, essentially resulting in misuse of ratepayer money. And they didn't really say what specifically. So we know there's something there. And what this audit did was follow up and say, can you show us what you're talking about? And I think, you can be critical of the limits of that audit kind of being driven by the information that FirstEnergy was willing to disclose. But it did show that they paid many millions of dollars to a wealthy individual. Companies affiliated with a wealthy individual named Tony George in the Cleveland area, and didn't do a great job of explaining how he's connected to Larry Householder case. But that money was actually included in Ohio rates. And presumably FirstEnergy wouldn't have disclosed it since no one was talking about it if it didn't have to do with the scandal somehow. So we'll see where that goes as well. But it did also say that they included some of the other money that went to Randazzo's consulting firms and to these dark money groups in various rates and chargers. And then there's still kind of an outstanding question of whether that money was actually collected from ratepayers due to rate caps and different things like that Puko has in place. So still kind of TBD on the worst of the worst spending, but pretty clear that we're kind of heading in the direction that the auditor recommended millions of dollars in refunds, and also that other money not be allowed to be included in future rates, which I think is pretty key, because FirstEnergy does have a pretty big rate case coming up in the next few years in Ohio, and that would be an opportunity, should the Puko allow it, for various stakeholders like the Ohio Consumers Council and environmental groups to really dig in and say, let's see some of the receipts of the spending if it's done right.
And I think I would just add one more point, that we've been talking about these separate PUCO cases, but in a way that it's like the old Indian folktale about blind guys and an elephant, where each case looks at just one part of the whole elephant, and there is not any big picture of the whole elephant. And that's frustrating both to journalists, and I think to the public and to advocates.
Yeah, I just thought that was a good clarification, Dave. I guess I was thinking like more, because we do know about those already. One other thing just about the compliance or the audit that came out yesterday was just that they noted that they couldn't get access to records from the audit period of 2016 through 2020 because the compliance officer had been separated from the company. So that's a huge gap that I just don't understand how you can just kind of dismiss it. So that there's a lot that's still being uncovered, because this is just not a very full report, and we probably need to see a lot more.
Yeah, and so this maybe leads into a question from Karen, which is it's fairly long, but I'll kind of try to summarize. Which she's asking sort of basically one part is, how did we come to find out about what was going on, and then the second part is how can other states or regions most effectively rapidly investigate to change unfair legal practices and mandate rapid change to a clean energy system? Are audits by the PUCO the place to start? Are there federal and not state officials that can do this audit? And this sort of gets at the next section here, which is sort of what are the levers of power to change and rectify things. So where do we start? We could start with the state legislature. And notably, after the scandal broke, that it was this was 2020, right? I've forgotten entirely what year it is. That all of the lawmakers who were up for election that year who had voted in favor of HB6, every single one of them was reelected. And in fact, some of the people who had voted against HB6 lost their races for office. What can be done at the legislative level when it seems like the public is pretty disengaged on this issue?
Well, we're actually right now in the middle of a redistricting effort in Ohio. We are horribly, horribly gerrymandered in this state. And I think a lot of that has given rise to some of this, to go back to our perfect storm discussion. I think, when we've got such safe districts that lawmakers get reelected after a bribery scandal, we've got an issue on our hands. And, Ohioans have demanded fair maps. And so we are going through that process right now. Unfortunately, I will tell you that it's not looking great at the moment. We've had some maps introduced that are actually even worse than the maps we're looking at right now. So I would say that, if you are in Ohio and listening to this, get out there and testify. There are hearings going on right now. Just one last night up in Cleveland. So if you're interested in helping make sure that we have fair maps and fair districts and fair representation, it's a really, really critical time in Ohio to address those issues.
And I would just add that the situation in Ohio now is not supposed to be business as usual. A couple of years ago, there was a deal made between the legislative leadership on the one hand and groups like the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and other groups on the other hand, where it was supposed to be a compromise and we were supposed to have everything out in the open. And, from my perspective, as a lawyer, as a journalist, it does not seem as if that promise to bring everything out in the open was being kept. And there's plans to move this forward within the next day or so. So even if one can't testify, one can contact their lawmakers and let them know what they think. And that's purely nonpartisan, just if you think that voters should be picking their leaders.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I would add FirstEnergy at least says that it has paused its contributions to 501c4 political groups, like the one that Larry Householder used to get House Bill 6 passed. And then it's also paused both collecting money from employees for its political action committee and distributing that money to politicians, which is pretty unusual to ever see a utility do, and kind of takes you how seriously they take the threat of these investigations. So it's sort of a moment of pause, and I'd imagine reconsideration of some lawmakers in Ohio of how closely tied to this utility they want to be if they're not getting any direct benefit from them. But of course also raises the question of, are they just finding a different way to spend that same money that we can't see, which, if we're true, would be really problematic for their deferred prosecution agreement with the Department of Justice.
And earlier we talked a little bit about the Public Utilities Commission, and we should probably outline, if anyone wants to field this, kind of how Sam Randazzo made his way to chair in the first place and kind of the opaqueness of that process, but also maybe hit on what can state regulators do, like what are they actually doing, what could they do that they're empowered to do that maybe they're not. So let's start with sort of like what, how the PUCO is kind of formed in the first place, just very briefly, if anyone wants to do that run down. I could probably do it, but I'll get it wrong.
I was going to see if Dave wanted to take it because we're talking about the nominating council. You were mentioning it earlier, so I didn't want to jump in.
I could take a crack and then feel free to correct me if I miss anything. But essentially, they open the process up when there's a seat that needs to be filled on the Puko. People can apply for the position and file resumes and such. And then it goes to what's called the Puko Nominating Council, which kind of weeds through all those applications and narrows it down to a handful of people. And the interesting thing about that Puko Nominating Council is, I think it was originally created as part of a compromise that avoided allowing the public to directly elect public utility commissioners in Ohio back in the 1980s. And it's sort of become another tool that utilities and their allies use to influence the Public Utility Commission by getting their people placed on this commission by people like the governor who appoints a member, different industries have a member, and then also I believe the Ohio House Speaker appoints someone. So Randazzo was on that Puko Nominating Council for many years before he threw in his hat and ended up becoming the Puko chairman. And he was appointed there by John Husted, who is, of course, now the Lieutenant Governor of Ohio. And there's some information that the Energy and Policy Institute has found in old SEC filings by FirstEnergy that shows that some firms and groups Randazzo was involved in back then were already getting money from FirstEnergy. So kind of raises another round of questions of just how long did John Husted know about this relationship? And he himself is pretty well known for being extremely cozy with FirstEnergy. So sort of illustrates the overall point that people have made over many years of this Puko Nominating Council has gone from being part of the solution to becoming part of the problem. And once it leaves their hand, they essentially send some names to the governor, who makes his appointment from a handful of nominees, and then that has to be approved by the legislature. But I think that legislative review is usually a pretty weak sauce, you could say.
And we have, so on that topic too, we have a couple of questions related to the possibility of revoking FirstEnergy's charter, and how would that work? Is that a realistic thing that might happen, or no?
Yeah, this is something that lots of us have discussed and debated a little bit about, because this is one of the most egregious things that I can imagine a utility could do, would be buying off, your legislature, essentially, as they're accused of, and admitted to as part of the deferred prosecution agreement. So, this is a real question, but, the difficulty of actually removing a charter from a public utility, I mean, it's a huge, huge process, right? This is a very, very difficult thing to do, and to have a public takeover of one of our utilities would be a massive process. So while an important consideration and something I think we should be talking about, it's very unlikely to happen, I think, despite the egregious nature of the actions that have been taken here.
Okay, any other thoughts on that? I'll jump into another question here. Where was I? From Ted, SB 117 that repeals the HB6 coal subsidy has had 2 committee appearances. Its sponsors are from both parties. What are the prospects for SB 117 getting passed this fall in Senate and then in the House? And we want to put some numbers on that one. We'll do a pool later.
Do some pool, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so our sister organization, OEC Action Fund, we are strongly in favor of Senate Bill 117. We plan to testify on it when we have the opportunity. And we certainly think that this has a chance of moving forward. And I think that the best time to get it done is now. If this doesn't get passed before the end of the year, I'd be surprised if it has legs again. But you're right, it is bipartisan. This is an important piece. And I think Senator Romanchuk's been a real champion for making sure that we have a level playing field for all of our different types of energy generation. So we're hoping that has some movement this fall.
Is there anything else happening in the legislature right now that people should be aware of related to this?
Yeah, so there's that OVEC repeal bill. There's also House Bill 351, which is a similar repeal, which is Representative Lanise leading the charge on that one. But then also on the House side, there is a bill, Energy Waste Reduction, House Bill 389, that is co-sponsored by Representative Bill Seitz and Representative Dave Leveland. And this, while doesn't reinstate our energy efficiency resource standards that we had before House Bill 6, it does move us forward in the right direction. And would be an important step to put residential programs back in place with energy efficiency residential programs, back in place. So we're interested in that one. And I also think I alluded to this earlier when I was mentioning this, but it shows me that our legislators think they've gone too far with a full repeal of our clean energy standards, I think, because it's very clear right now we have no energy waste reduction, energy efficiency programs for residential customers, and this would reinstate those. So that's another bill that we're keeping a close eye on.
Right. And I would just add, there have been bills for clean full repeals of House Bill 6 pending since January. But again, they've been stalled. And part of that may be this whole accountability issue in the legislature.
And so looking forward, we have another question here. Both Householder and Matt Borges have pled not guilty. This question from Mike. Do you think one or both will be convicted or at least plead to a lesser crime? And that's sort of a delicate question to speculate on, but we could add to that, are there other figures or entities that we haven't discussed yet that we're still kind of waiting to see the other shoe drop on?
I mean, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen in a criminal case, what a jury is going to decide if it goes to trial, or what somebody may decide to do upon advice of his or her counsel. So we really can't make a good prediction there. And again, as Dave mentioned, there are ongoing investigations. So we really can't say who will or won't get charged in the future. We can only say we've been told by the district attorney's office that they're still investigating.
Yeah, I would just add, there was an interview published a few months ago with a couple of the agents involved in the federal investigation into Larry Householder, and they essentially said, keep in mind that I believe it was under the Obama administration, there was a Department of Justice memo that went around saying, essentially, the best way to hold corporations accountable is to actually charge the executives who run it with crimes, when that can be proven. And we haven't seen that yet in this case, but I think a lot of the information that was included in the deferred prosecution agreement and the earlier court filings aimed at Larry Householder certainly point their finger to some key people like FirstEnergy's former CEO, Charles Jones, who was fired. So can't say for certain whether we'll see more charges aimed at individuals, but they seem to be hinting that that's certainly something that they're keeping in their minds in terms of the federal agents that are investigating the cases.
And there's a question here that maybe we don't have an answer for, but this is from John and it's directed specifically, Dave, at you. Do you get any sense that other utilities across the nation have been chastened by the FirstEnergy example, or is the lesson just don't get caught? That's a stumper. Lucia, do you have any thoughts?
This is such a great question, particularly as there's been so little accountability. Larry Householder was finally expelled, but only after he was reelected. So does that mean legislators take it seriously? Does it mean that they don't? But hopefully this whole, we had legislators, I did a story on Representative Hagan, who told me that, and this is before anyone got arrested, that people whom she would not name had called her up and basically said, you're going to support HB6 or we're going to fund your competitor. And they did. So hopefully those calls have stopped, and those are calls that, journalists can't track. We're limited to public records. So I really hope that this has been a lesson, at least for the people doing it, but we'll really have to see.
Great.
Excellent. I think in Illinois, ComEd, I don't know if I would call it a similar case, but has also been caught up in an investigation and reached a similar deferred prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors. And certainly there's other states where we know utilities have at least been subpoenaed and investigated in corruption related cases, and hasn't quite reached the level of charges, but did spur investigations by more state level authorities like state AGs or public utility commissions. So certainly I think the writing is on the wall, and probably the variety of the cases that have popped up in different states just shows you all the different mechanisms that utilities use to influence politics in different ways. This dark money stuff just being one example, and some of the other ones more having to do with like traditional lobbyists going overboard.
Great. Well, thanks. Well, this is a story that, as we discussed, is continuing to unfold and is ongoing. And we here at Energy News Network and also ION Ohio will be continuing to cover this story. We are both nonprofit newsrooms, and we welcome your support. A lot of folks donated to ENN through the registration process, so I will invite you to also consider making contributions to ION Ohio as well, and also to Ohio Environmental Council. And Dave doesn't want your money. So Dave's organization does not take individual donations. So feel free to share the wealth with ION Ohio and the Ohio Environmental Council. I also neglected to acknowledge the George Gunn Foundation, which supports our news coverage in Ohio. So we're very grateful for their ongoing support. And I'm going to kick a question out to the panel here shortly, just after a couple more housekeeping things. Thanks again to everyone who submitted questions. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of them. Again, this is like a very, very sprawling and complex thing to wrap your arms around, and I appreciate our panelists participating today. You will, if you are registered for this event, you will receive an email here sometime in the next day or so with a recording of the event, as well as links to our ongoing coverage at ENN and also ION Ohio. We encourage you to continue to stay engaged. We have newsletters you can subscribe to, and really excited to see so many people who are involved and curious about this story. So to wrap things up, our last question to the panelists is going to be, what is an unanswered question that you have about this situation that you would like to see unfold down the road? So we'll start with Lucia.
Well, to me, in the past year, I've learned to appreciate what's going into my lungs a lot more. So, I'm wondering, how does this affect clean air in Ohio? We have put an extreme amount of carbon into our environment already. And then Ohio's answer has been to pretty much double down on carbon. So, how can we transform our economy to being cleaner and to being greener? And what is the true cost? Because, $60 million seems like a lot, but actually trying to, when you think about the costs down the road from, the issues that are caused by dirty energy, I think that's something that I'd like to know more about.
I think you're muted, Ken, but I think it's my turn. So, so my unanswered question is similar to Lucia's. Actually, I spend my time trying to figure out how we make progress in the fight against climate change, and specifically here in Ohio, because you cannot win the fight against climate change if we don't make progress here in Ohio. We're too big a polluter, right? We're sixth in the nation or something, I think, at this point. I can't remember our direct number, but so that's what I think about. When we've got these roadblocks at the legislature, we don't know how this redistricting effort's going to come out, whether we're going to have fairer districts that actually allow us to make some progress or not. But I will say, I don't want to leave on a sad note. I'm really, really happy to see a lot of the progress that's being made at the local level. We look at the state level, and we've seen all these different things we've talked about here today. But when you look at the local level, we have city council people, we have mayors across the state of Ohio that are dedicated to making a more sustainable future for their communities and for the people that live there. And so I'm excited about that aspect, and that those people are eventually going to become future leaders of Ohio, and we'll be able to move forward.
Great. A year and a half of this, and I still don't know how to use Zoom. So Kathy, you're up.
I want to know what the next scheme is, whether it involves nonprofits or for-profit limited liability corporations. And in a related vein, how is government, how is the public supposed to be able to prevent the next scheme if we don't yet have access to a full picture and all the information about what's gone on here?
Great. Dave, last word to you.
I'm interested to see whether there are more charges announced by the federal investigators and if more individuals or companies are charged in relation to these various bribery schemes, or perhaps a totally new thing that they've uncovered through their investigations.
Great. Thank you. Once again, we are out of time. So thanks again to our panelists today and to all of you for joining us for this webinar. As always, we are going to, as I mentioned, we're going to send out an email with more information, and you can continue to follow this story on ENN and also ION Ohio. So thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks.